Hello, everyone. We have come back today, as promised, with the wonderful author Salman Rashid. This is day 34 of our series, 75 Days of Partition. I am a Prajata, a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive. It is my great luck and absolute honor to be talking to Salman Rashid today. He is Pakistan's leading travel writer. He is the author of 12 travel books, and he has also written a personal story, A Time of Madness, a memoir of partition. Salman Rashid is Pakistan's most widely traveled travel writer, with very few places in the country that do not carry his footprints. He is acclaimed as the most erudite travel writer of Pakistan. His books include The Apricot Road to Yarkand, Jhelum, the City of Vitasta, Deosai, Land of the Giant, The Salt Range and the Potohar Plateau, Sea Monsters and the Sun God, Prisoners on a Bus travels through Pakistan, from Landi Kotal to Wagah, and his most recent one, Gwadar, Song of the Sea Wind. He is also the fellow of the Geographical Society UK and the only Pakistani to have seen the north face of K2 and trekked in the shadow of this great mountain. His work, his explorations, his travelogues keep appearing in the leading publication and on his blog. Sir, thank you very much for agreeing to come and speak here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Uh, Sir, we'll directly come to your time of madness, your memoir. It speaks of a personal tale of, brutality and trauma that your family witnessed and a journey to retrace that past. How have you, dealt with that trauma of your family, and what inspired you to go back to Jalandhar and seek the perpetrators?
You see, I went to Jalandhar in 2008. That's a pretty long time after partition and after whatever happened. And I, um, I wanted to go there to find out what had happened to my dada dadi, my paternal grandparents, two aunts, and a great grandfather, and the servant, his wife, and his five children. Mainly because no one in our family had ever spoken of of the past of Jalandhar and how it was. We had this very scanty sort of information from my Masi, from our aunt on the my maternal aunt, and sometimes from my paternal aunt as well. Fleetingly, they would say something which stuck with me. But the major thing was that no one knew what had happened to those who did not turn up in what was then Pakistan, the new Pakistan. I wanted to find out what had happened. And that was the only reason I wanted to go. I knew it was a very long time after the event, and I knew the actual perpetrator might not even be there anymore. Uh, um, uh, but I just wanted to see if I could find any trace, any memory of what had happened there. That's what took me to Jalandhar.
So, was it, until you got to know, was it haunting you in any way? This trauma that had been in bits and pieces passed from the generation, that you never got to meet, right? And the information about whom was passed to you. So, was it haunting you in any way?
It was in a way. I kept thinking of it, and sometimes I rued why I was born in 1952 and not 10 years earlier, so that I could have gone to India in the 50s or the 60s to meet the person who had actually seen what had happened. Um, but that's how things are. Some things are just beyond your control.
So, would you like to tell us more about your this visit to Jalandhar? What happened there?
Um, I went to I stayed at Desh Bhagat Hall, and I showed them a picture of my grandfather's house, uh, which my mother's cousin, who had gone back to Jalandhar in 1985, had taken that picture, and I have a copy here. um, um, uh, I showed them. I had taken a photocopy of this image, and I said I want to go to this place, and they said, this is Bhagat Singh Chowk, Bhagat Singh crossing in Railway Road. So it was like I think it was like a movie scene. I was holding this thing and sitting in the back of a cycle rickshaw, driven by a young chap from Bihar. He was a Muslim, and he had 16 or 17 other siblings. And he told me that all his father ever did was booze up the live long day. He was completely wasted man. Anyway, I sat there, and when I saw my grandfather's house in the distance, I said, "All right, I'll get off here," and I walked up. Um, on the far side from my grandfather's house, on the far side, I walked on the pavement, looking up, and then I went to this. My grandfather's house has two stores in front, or facing Railway Road. I went to this hardware store. It was run by this young Sikh person. He was dealing with some customers, and I just went and stood there quietly. So after he was done, he says to me, "Yes, what do you want?" And I said, "No, nothing. I don't want anything. But you're sitting in my grandfather's. You're doing business in my grandfather's property." So Iqbal Singh, that's his name, he came around and he hugged me very warmly. And then we sat down. He told me to sit down, and he went back to the other side of the counter. And then suddenly he puts his hand on mine and he says, "Was your grandfather a doctor?" I said, I hadn't said a word about my grandfather being a doctor. I said, "How do you know?" He says, I have a customer who knows the whole story of what happened to Dr. Saab, and he speaks of it very often. Would you like to meet him? I said, "Yes, I'd like to meet him." And he said, "Okay, let me see who it is now. I can't recall." And then he went into this thing, and it, this went on for 3 or 4 days actually, and he took me to all the wrong places. The funny thing was, he took me to the house of the Suris, a couple of lanes behind my grandfather's house. Mr. Suri was from Rawalpindi, Mrs. Suri was from Lahore. Mr. Suri was 89 years old in 2008. Mrs. Suri was about 86, I think, or 85, and they remembered partition extremely well. They had Mrs. Suri was a very active, politically very active. Mr. Suri uh, also was, as any young person would have been, and their brood had flown. They lived alone by themselves, so they didn't have anyone to talk to. I was like God sent to them. And they just grabbed me, and Mr. Suri was full of stories about Rawalpindi and Raja Bazar and this and that. And oh God. And Mrs. Suri had, you know, when Mr. Suri stopped talking, Mrs. Suri would pick up about Lahore. And, it just was endless. And I wanted to know about my grandfather. I didn't want to hear about Raja Bazar or Shazmi in Lahore. So I actually literally had to wrench myself free and escape from them. And I came back to Iqbal and I said, "Paiji, that was a dud. Those people, those wonderful people, but they are unfortunately from that side of the border." And then I was introduced to other people. I was pointed in this direction and that. And the days were going by, and I was in Jalandhar, because you see I had begun my journey in Delhi. I had gone up to Solan, where my surviving aunt was living with her husband, who was a surveyor. and they very nearly got killed by the mob. It was just good fortune they escaped. So I had come from Solon, and I now had 5 days in Jalandhar. So 3 days had gone by. On the fourth day, I was going to my village because the good people of Desh Bhagat Hall had arranged for me to meet this young man, Bakshish Singh from Ugi, our village, who was going to take me there. And I said to Iqbal Singh on the fourth day, Iqbal Singh, I think you are afraid of letting me meet that person because you think, I might get violent or what. Uh, but trust me, I'm not that kind of a man. And Iqbal Singh, sort of cut me and he says, no, 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 don't worry about that. I completely understand you. I don't think, it's not that. I just cannot remember who this person is. So I said, look, tomorrow I'm in the village, and the day after I have to leave here early to be able to cross the border. I don't. I'm not taking chances. I'll go and stay in Amritsar the night and cross the border the next morning because that's the last day of my visa. And he says, I hope I can recall who it is. So next day I went to the village, and little kindnesses that people did to me. Across the street from my grandfather's home was this uh, agency of for bottled gas run by Kailash Sehgal Saab. He was, I think he said he was either 2 years old at the time of partition or born about the time of partition. He had heard stories of my grandfather, but he didn't know what had happened to them, which means that even in the 1950s, th- there were people who were talking of my grandfather. So Kailash Sehgal Saab had asked me if it had worked out for me, if I had met someone who could tell me what had happened and what I was going to do tomorrow. So I said, tomorrow I'm going to the village. And he says, how are you going to go there? I said, I'll hire a taxi. He says, no, you don't worry, I'll send somebody, he'll take you there. So in the morning, this tampu, they call it in Punjab, a rickshaw, a three-wheeler, tuk tuk. It arrived and he drove me to the village is only about, I think, 30 kilometers south of Jalandhar. Uh, and when we got off at Bakshish Singh's home, I asked how much to pay, and he says 400. I paid him 400. So when I got back in, okay, now I'm in the village, and I meet Sardar Saudagar Singh, who introduces me to Pandit Fakir Chand Sangar, who knew my grandfather so well that he could even tell me what sort of neckties my grandfather wore. And he, because he was, my grandfather was the civil surgeon at the Nakodar Hospital, which was the Tehsil headquarters for our village. And Pandit Fakir Chand was doing his matriculation from the high school there. And he says, Dr. Saab was very kind to me. I could write very fine Persian script. So he had told his staff to let me fill in their registers. And I was paid char ane, 4 annas in those days. That's a quarter rupee. And he told me other things about my grandfather as well. If you want, we can talk about how po- po- politics change a person's outlook. Because Fakir Chand said, your grandfather was a very fair and even person. No matter who the patient was, he treated everyone equally. There was no prejudice in that man. He was a very good man. He insisted that my grandfather was a good man. And as after this visit, we came back to Sardar Saudagar Singh's place, and as we were sitting down to lunch, I had a SIM. I had a local SIM given to me by friends in Amritsar. I hope that's not against the law. Anyway, I'm not naming my friends in Amritsar. The phone rang, and it was Iqbal Singh, very excited. He says, Paiji, I've, I've met the man. he's here, and he wants to meet you too. So I became so excited. I My appetite fled. I just wanted to get back to Jalandhar. Anyway, but Sardar Saudagar Singh said, no, 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 don't worry. You eat your lunch with us, and then Bakshish will drive you back to Jalandhar. So he drove me back to Jalandhar, and j- coincidentally, he dropped me off right in front of Kailash Sagal's bottled gas store. As I got off, I heard this very angry, Rashid Saab, ure aao. And I was quite surprised by the curtness of the tone. So I went up to the store, and he says, "Why have you done this?" And I said, "What have I done?" He came around the counter and he stuffed something in my pocket. I looked in, and there was this 400 rupees. He says, "You were not supposed to pay that, man. Why did you do it?" I said, "Well, I didn't know." He said 400, and I gave him the 400. He says, "No, you're a guest from Pakistan. For goodness sake, you were not supposed to do this." I was amazed by this kindness. And what was our relationship? Only that his family had always lived opposite my grandfather's home. Anyway, I came across the street, and seeing me across the street, Iqbal Singh had got on the phone, and he had called um, the gentleman who knew everything. And soon we had Mahinder Pratap Sehgal Saab, 73 or 74 years old in 2008, and stocky uh, man. And the first thing, we shook hands. I said namaskar to him. We shook hands, and the first thing he said to me is, "Look here, I'm very sorry. This was all the doing of my father." मैं सब तो पहले ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਬੜੀ ਮਾਫੀ ਮੰਗਣਾ ਚਾਹਨਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਮੇਰੇ ਪਿਓ ਦਾ ਸੀ. And with him saying this, it, it suddenly I became detached from the situation. I became detached from reality. Fortunately, what I had done was that as I was walking across the street, I had taken out my recording machine from my bag, and I had turned it on. So I think everything was recorded, or everything that Mahinder Pratap Saab said is recorded. Uh, and when he apologized for the deed of his father, I sort of, that was it. When someone says this to you on account of someone who's been dead for more than 30 years, uh, yes, more than 30 years, what do you do? Uh, Anyway, uh, he told me the whole story. He said, I thought, you see, my belief was, I had heard from my father that my grandfather and Lala Bhigchand, between my grandfather's home and Lala Bhigchand's home runs Krishna Gali, a short street. Uh, Lala Bhigchand and my granddad were the same age, retired from government service the same year, I think the year before partition, and they were very close friends. They used to spend much of their time together, and uh, everyone here in Lahore, in my family, believed that our grandfather, the family would have been with in the keeping of Lala Bhigchand in the final hours of the days, and they must have been pressured to give them up. And uh, 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 I tried to say this to Mahinder Pratap Saab, and he says, "No, no, no." He took me by the hand, and he said, "Let me tell you how it happened." And we walked into Krishna Gali, and the funny thing is that this waspish woman who now lives in my grandfather's house. She's a Malhotra. Her son and a daughter-in-law were wonderful. When we went back a year later, a year and a half later, my wife and I, they were so welcoming. It was unbelievable. And I sort of a little unsure of the situation. I asked, "Where's the old woman?" And and the young Mrs. Malhotra broke out laughing or sort of giggling in a way, knowing way. And she says, "Why? What happened?" And I told her the story of how nasty she had been, with me on the first visit in 2008. And, as Mahinder Pratap Saab was walking me into the street, we saw this woman sitting on the threshold. And I said, "Look, Bhaiji, she doesn't let me go into my grandfather's home." And Mahendra Pratap Sahib was very angry. He arms akimbo. He said to the woman, who the hell do you think you are, not letting this man get into his grandfather's house? Get out of the way!" And he actually kicked her out. He pushed him with his foot, pushed her out of the way. And he said, "Go, it's your grandfather's house. You go spend as much time inside as you want." And that was when I actually went in and saw the whole house. Because the first time, although the woman, after much um, unpleasantness, had let me in, she had carried on screaming for me to get out. And she had also told me, "Even if you see this house, you're not getting it back." I had to tell her, "Look here, we are now two different countries. I can just, there is just no way I can get this house back. So don't worry about that." Now we're back in with Mahinder Pratap Saab, and he's walking me into Krishna Gali, and he says, "Look, this was Idu's room." Now I hadn't mentioned Idu, the servant. My grandfather had him for donkey's years. He had built him a home as well, a small house somewhere. But Idu just wouldn't leave the family. He kept living with the family. And he says, when my father was leading this um, this mob, and this roar arose, Idu was in this room. Dr. Saab and the others were not in Lala Bhikchand's home, because everyone knew of their friendship and everyone would have automatically gone to Lala Bhikchand. He was also a Sagal, Lala Bhikchand. He said, when the roar, the noise rose, Idu panicked. He got out of the room and made straight for the Chopra's home in this lane behind Lala Bhikchand's home. He made for the Chopra's home where they had hidden my grandfather and the rest of the family. And Mahinder Pratap Saab's father was leading the mob that had come to kill them. And he um, he ran after Idu. The senior Mr. Sagal ran after Idu and saw him getting into the Chopra's house and saw him knocking on the door where everyone was in hiding inside. They didn't open up, so he ran up the stairs. Mahendra Pratap Sagal's dad ran up after Idu, stabbed him to death, and Idu was carrying his 2-year-old son. He threw the little child from the roof 2 floors up into the courtyard below. And then they came. Then he came down and very systematically. Remember the doors in the old houses with those panels? They undid a panel, undid the bolts inside, and uh, first of all, according to Mahendra Pratap Saab, someone had a shotgun. They stuck it in. There was a hole in the door. They stuck it in and fired a single shot, which got my grandfather either in the eye or in the head. And he just collapsed. And then they undid this. They didn't break down the door. They undid a panel, undid the bolt, and went in. And according to Mahendra Pratap Shah, they killed everyone. Not a single living person left that room. And according to him, they put all the bodies on two hand carts, and there was this store, timber store, run by some Pathans who had already left Jalandhar. They took the bodies there and burnt them. That's what he told me. Now, I said I had become detached from the situation, and this detail that had come from Mahinder Pratap Sahib, it was, uh, I, I, we came out of the house and we were standing in the shade of this shadow of this building, and I said, Bhaiji, you are now 74 or 73, I don't remember, but I had calculated in my mind. I said, you were 13 years old at the time of partition. How were you in the mob? What was a 13-year-old child doing in a mob? And he says, you've not been listening to me carefully. I've told you. And he was angry and vehement, very vehement. He said, I told you it was my father who did this evil." And then we talked. I said, how do you know so much detail? He says, until my father died in 1973, he he says the ruin began, the sorrow began 3 or 4 days after the event. And my father said, these were good people. I shouldn't have done it. I've committed a great evil. I shouldn't have done this. And he says, until the day he died in 73, he went over it again and again, and how cruel everyone had been to, blameless people, innocent people, and good people. Mahinder Pratap Sahab kept saying good. My father said they were good people. We shouldn't have done this. And, the strange thing is, in 2008, it was like almost 60 years to partition, from partition. Mahinder Pratap still referred to my grandfather as our Dr. Saab, Sade Dr. Saab. Our Dr. Saab did this, our Dr. Saab did that. And uh, uh, but that's the whole story. Mm.
I think your journey to Jalandhar must have required a lot of courage on your part, and like you say, bore you did not bear any feelings of revenge, or there were not any violent thoughts in your mind. But I'm really urged to ask you that it's only natural that somebody in your position would have been afraid. So were you scared? At the thought of meeting this past that you were trying to unravel, and everybody who went through partition trauma or partition, they were not so lucky uh, to really get to know what happened to their near and dear ones. So when you got to know about your past, did it provide you a kind of catharsis? What kind of feelings did you have after you had known the truth?
Well, the first thing that uh, was a thankfulness, a, a thankfulness for being able to know what had happened. My father had died 3 years earlier, so I couldn't come home and tell him what had happened. But there was a thankfulness, and there was no fear. Not even for a moment was there any fear of facing someone who might hold something against me, because I wasn't holding anything against anyone in India. And the second thing is, this is very important. The moment we had met, Mahinder Pratap Sehgal had said to me, had apologized to me on behalf of his dead father. And then he kept telling, in the end, he told me that his father had repented until the day he died. So, how do you hold a grudge against such a person? I think if I had met the senior Mr. Sehgal, I don't think there would have been any hatred. I might have felt sorry for him. Uh, uh, what had happened in 1947 could not be undone. It can never be undone. Um, but to have carried the grudge for 60 years was not human. It's uh, it's uh, it's below humanity.
Yes, you're right in saying that, and there's a lot to learn from this one story that you have related about forgiveness, and we will be coming back to it. But before that, I want to, I'm also fascinated by a list of books that you have published about your travels, and they are not just about the beauty of the place or giving other details, but they also talk about the history of those places, and the names of these places surely sound like they are very fascinating, and that places somebody would like to visit. uh, but what kind of difficulties have you faced during your travels, like just before you were sharing that you were on your travels without any fear and you had traveled so much, and also share some incidents that might have changed, because a person who travels a lot gets to learn a lot, and I think, from my perspective, they have the greatest knowledge, a person who has traveled far and wide. So share some incidents that might have happened during that time that changed your perspective towards life.
Um, your perspective changes when you meet people, all sorts of people, and you realize that we are all the same. Um, the same kind of things that make us happy or sad. Cultures may be different, but the human inside is very much alike. And when we don't know the other, we are afraid of them. But once you get to know them, the fear is shed, and then the state of being unafraid begins to expand. You can you can be afraid of a man in North Waziristan, and label him a terrorist, but when you meet him, you see that he's a very human being, and so when you meet somebody in Germany, the first time I went to England, I have to tell you this, I wanted to meet some people from the National Front, but the friends I was staying with, they were British, and they said, no, we're not going to let you meet anyone, these racists from the National Front, or whatever they used to call them. I don't know, but you see, the state of being unafraid begins to expand with the more people you meet, and um, incidents. I I remember a time in 1990. I had done this long trek, 1100 kilometers from the Western Himalayas through the Karakorums into the Hindu Kush, and I arrived in a little remote village northwest of Gilgit, mm, and my guide, that was as far as my guide was bringing me. And then I walked across about 8 kilometers to this other village and was sitting by a store where they said the Jeep would take me wherever I wanted to go. And this was next to a butcher's shop, so there were a lot of flies. And then somebody called me into this two-room building. It turned out to be the office of the Public Works Department with two engineers there. They began to interview me how I was from Lahore and how I was traveling all by myself, and how I was carrying this heavy backpack, etc., etc. And um, then they said, haven't you been afraid you could get into trouble with someone? And I said, no, I, I haven't been in trouble. He says, no, no, you don't know. There are bad people all around. And I said, I've never met bad people. mainly because I believe in the inherent goodness of human beings. And and they both looked at each other, and one of them said, "Inherent goodness of human beings." कोई चाकू फेर जाएगा तो पता चलेगा. So, but I tell you, in all these years of traveling, I've never, in Europe or in Pakistan or in India, I've never been threatened. I've never felt threatened. Uh, but the perspective that you were asking about, it changes when you meet people.
So your, this phrase, the state of being unafraid, could very well be the motto for the young generation today. And speaking of that, this instance, the story of forgiveness that you were relating earlier, were you inspired by any kind of philosophy that you had learned it from, or was it just your natural instinct as a human being that you proceeded to forgive the perpetrators? And what kind of message would you like to give to the current and future generation?
There's been a break in your transmission, Prajita. Could you please come again? The last part of your question.
Yes, sure, sir. I was saying that, were you inspired by any kind of philosophy? Did you pick up from anywhere from the ancient texts, or was it your natural instinct as a human being that you proceeded on to forgive the perpetrators of the crime towards your family? And what message would you like to give to the current and future generation?
I'm not not a reader of philosophy. I'm not even a reader of fiction. So I'm a reader of history and geography. So I don't know where I got this from, but I think there is uh, the spirit of forgiveness lives within us all, and if we suppress it, it won't come out. You've got to let it grow. I think the spirit inside me just grew, and to the younger people, especially of India and Pakistan, who say nasty things about each other, uh, I can only say that you've got to learn. Uh, you've got to understand that we are the same people, and um, if you are if all these young people are permitted to meet each other, they'll reach that same state of being unafraid, and they'll lose their hatred for each other. So I think these young people have to keep an open mind and meet each other, and that's the beginning, and that's the message.
Uh, Tonight's talk had a very special message for everyone. I think only when we have embraced this idea of forgiveness, we can liberate ourselves from this vicious grips of the past, and otherwise, we are always in the danger of repeating history, repeating itself again and again. And sometimes I think we have to remember certain things or get to know the truth just in order to forget. Just like I think is for your case, because we just remember the lessons and we forget the hatred that is contained in the story. And like you said, that we are one people and only together we can build a future which is peaceful and harmonious. Thank you, Salman Rashid, for teaching us this valuable lesson this evening. Uh, Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Viewers, please keep showing your love and support and keep tuning in for more episodes like this at the same time. Take care until we meet again.